First of all, this appalling incident at a point where hundreds of Palestinians were desperately trying to collect food aid that was finally shipped into northern Gaza a few days ago. The trucks arrived very early in the morning. The kind of thermal imaging that was taken by the IDF overnight shows hundreds of Palestinians converging on these trucks, and in the process, in the chaos, 120 or so people died. Now, on the ground, Palestinians are saying that those people died because they were killed, they were targeted, they were shot at by Israeli soldiers. The Israeli army first said, yes, there were some shots fired. Then they denied that shots were fired. Then they said that most of the people who died because they were trampled on by each other in the stampede that followed. We don't really know exactly what happened. Doctors on the ground in the local hospitals, the few that are still operating, are saying that most of the people they treated had gunshot wounds. 80% had gunshot wounds. The other 20% had the kind of injuries you sustain in a stampede. The IDF says that's not the case. The point is that we don't really know for sure because we, foreign journalists, and and there's been some incredibly courageous Palestinian journalists, and they're trying to find out as well. But it's always good to have someone from the outside coming in. We are not allowed to go into the Gaza Strip. And this week, after weeks and months of asking to get access, we finally all got together, or a lot of us, certainly in the broadcast field, 56 journalists from all the big organizations, signed a letter saying we want access, unfettered access to the Gaza Strip, either via Egypt or via Israel, with the authority of both, and not just the kind of short trips that the IDF have been organizing, where you go in for a couple of hours and they censor your pictures and they don't allow you to speak to any Palestinians. Unfettered access, the way we have or try to have in most other war zones, and that has so far not been granted. But if it had been granted, we might get a clearer idea of what actually happened in that horrific incident on the Al-Rashid Road in Gaza a few days ago. Let's speak to Shaina Low. She's the communications advisor with the Norwegian Refugee Council, and she's calling for funding of UNRWA. And UNRWA, by the way, is of course the UN organization that is active inside the Gaza Strip, the main one. Their funding was stopped by the United States, by Britain and other countries after an allegation from the Israelis that 12 UNRWA workers had participated in the October the 7th attack. So she joins us now from the West Bank. Shaina, good morning.
Good morning.
We'll get on to that issue that I just referred to in a minute. But first of all, what's the latest that you've heard about this terrible incident in the Gaza Strip?
All we know, because we did not have staff present in the area when the incident occurred, is what's been reported and what we're hearing through word of mouth from our colleagues on the ground. What is clear, however, is that the level of desperation in the Gaza Strip as a result of the trickle of aid, the mere trickle of aid that's entering Gaza, is leading to chaos. It's leading to civil unrest. It's leading to unnecessary deaths that just should not be happening. If aid agencies and humanitarians were given unfettered access throughout Gaza to be able to distribute aid to those who are in need, if we were allowed to get the quantities of aid in that are needed, we wouldn't have the levels of desperation, and there wouldn't be incidents like the one we saw a couple of days ago.
And that's the bigger point here, isn't it? I mean, it's terrible to shoot at anyone who's desperately trying to get hold of food, and that stampede is a terrible thing as well. But the context of this is the sheer desperation of almost 300,000 people still left in the north of the Gaza Strip, which is something that most people ignore, as well as the 1.8 million in the south who just don't get enough food, they don't get enough water. The basic requirements for living have been denied.
Absolutely. Even our staff, I spoke yesterday to one of my colleagues, and he looks almost unrecognizable because he's lost so much weight over the last 5 months, and he's one of the luckier ones living in Rafah. We have a number of staff who remain in northern Gaza, stranded in northern Gaza, who cannot move due to varying circumstances, who have told us that they've run out of flour, they've run out of cooking oil, they've run out of rice, and they're quickly running out of animal fodder, which is what they've resorted to eat. This is levels of starvation that are on the rise. 1 in 6 children under the age of 2 in northern Gaza are suffering from acute malnutrition. This is just unprecedented numbers and so quickly that we've seen starvation spread, and we are on the brink of a famine, particularly in northern Gaza, but also throughout the Gaza Strip as a whole.
Okay, and just describe the situation in northern Gaza, because there's just so little aid getting through to northern Gaza. Why is that?
There's a few different reasons. First of all, the World Food Program had to suspend operations to northern Gaza a couple of weeks ago. They announced this. And that's simply because they cannot, the coordination system for deconfliction to ensure that aid trucks will not be targeted is not working. It's failing. On February 5th, the Israelis directly hit a UN convoy heading to northern Gaza. And so it simply is unsafe. And the few, there were only a handful of convoys that were actually even approved within the first month and a half of this year. Out of 77 requests, only 15 were either partially or fully coordinated. So that's one big issue. Second of all, the levels of desperation are so great that it's incredibly difficult for aid trucks to maneuver from southern Gaza to reach the north, because all trucks are entering from the south, from the Rafah crossing or the Kerem Shalom crossing, to reach the north. And so as aid convoys are moving through the crowded streets, desperate Palestinians in southern and central Gaza are seeking out that aid and often approaching trucks and trying to gather the aid themselves before it's able to reach the north. So even the convoys that reach the north are not complete.
Right. And many people are saying that as a result of this horrible incident just a few days ago, any negotiations for a ceasefire and a prisoner exchange, a hostage and prisoner exchange, may be complicated and kicked further into the long grass. You desperately need that pause in the fighting, that ceasefire, don't you, to get those 500 trucks a day in that were being brought in before the war started?
Well, it's not just a temporary ceasefire that we need. We need a permanent ceasefire. We need to be able to, and we need unfettered access throughout Gaza in order to be able to distribute aid. Even without a ceasefire, though, we need to, even if that is not going to happen immediately, we need to see an increase in the number of trucks entering Gaza per day. The Kerem Shalom crossing has capacity for 1,000 trucks per day. Prior to October 7th, an average of 500 trucks were going through per working day. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing just a trickle of that over the last 4.5 months.
And Shaina, just tell me finally, have the Israelis actually given you the evidence with which they claim that 12 of your employees took part in the Hamas attacks, on the back of which, a number of countries, including your biggest donors, the United States, Britain and others, cancelled their funding for UNRWA?
Well, I actually work for the Norwegian Refugee Council, which is separate from UNRWA. But the 12, and none of our employees, just to be clear, have been accused of being involved in the hostilities.
None of yours, I'm just talking about UNRWA here. Yeah.
But for UNRWA, my understanding is that none of that evidence has been presented to UNRWA. It hasn't been seen, and UNRWA took immediate measures as soon as they learned of the allegations to address the issue. But it's outrageous to think that a handful of employees acting outside their professional capacities would lead to the punishment of millions of innocent civilians trapped inside of a war zone. Okay.
Shaina Low there from the Norwegian Refugee Council in the West Bank. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Let's speak to my colleague, the international editor of Channel 4 News, colleague and friend, Lindsey Hilsum, who's one of the signatories of that letter that we all sent off last week. Lindsey, you're in Israel. Good morning.
Good morning, Matt. I am between Ramallah and Jerusalem at the moment. So I am somewhere between the West Bank. In fact, I'm still on the West Bank heading into Jerusalem.
I know the road well. You're about to get to that checkpoint where you'll be asked to show your papers, and then hopefully you'll be able to get through. Not everyone does get through that easily, as we know. Listen, Lindsey, I've just tried to, this terrible incident, this tragedy of 110 people or maybe more killed when they were trying to get hold of some food in the desperate circumstances of northern Gaza. Is that for you an illustration of why we, people like us, should be allowed to go into the Gaza Strip to actually see what's going on the ground? Because if we were, we would be able to speak to the doctors in the few hospitals still left. We would be able to see some of the wounded, and we'd be able to stand up, the claim and the counterclaim.
Absolutely, but the first thing I would have to say is the most important thing is to get aid through to the 300,000 Palestinians who are still in Gaza City. Because I've been talking to a lot of senior UN officials of the last few days, and they are just desperately anxious. Your previous speaker from the Norwegian Refugee Council may have been talking about this as well.
Yeah, she did.
That, it's 5 weeks since food got in there, and that's one of the reasons that small convoy came under such pressure. But yes, of course. I mean, I look at what's on the agency feeds. I try and speak to people in Gaza. Then I call the Israeli Defense Force. I get all sorts of different versions of what happened. If I were there, if you were there, talking to people ourselves, we would be able to come to some kind of conclusion ourselves from eyewitness reports. So yes, of course, it's really important that we should be there. And in the past, when you've had sort of investigations into these kind of incidents, the investigations take a long time, and they don't necessarily get to the bottom of what really happened.
When we sent out that letter, which was organised by Alex Crawford from Sky News, there was quite a bit of response on social media saying, first of all, why have you left it so late? And then what about places like Sudan or Myanmar, North Korea, where you also can't report? I mean, there is a difference, isn't there, between the lack of access here?
Difference.
Just tell us about that.
Well, there are two things. First of all, sometimes I think the 4 places I want to report from now, I can't get visas to any of them. Yeah. Which Gaza, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Russia. But I think that the point with Gaza is this is a very internationalized conflict. Gaza is a place that we have all been to many times. It has to be said that it's not just the Israelis, it's also the Egyptians. The journalists are not allowed to cross from Egypt into Gaza, which should be possible, both physically and, in terms of getting permission.
And we did address the letter to both governments, didn't we?
We absolutely did. But the main thing is also that, the burden on our Palestinian colleagues is extraordinary. And we're talking to about, 80, 90, we don't even know quite how many, 80, 90, maybe 100 Palestinian journalists who have been killed in this conflict, killed for doing their jobs. But also, their lives are so difficult because they're also trying to survive, look after their families. And some of them, I am involved in a small charity, the Marie Colvin Journalist Network, which is named after a colleague who you also knew, Marie Colvin, who was killed in Syria in 2012. We have 8 members, all women in there. And most of them are living in tents. So they're living in tents, looking after their children and trying to work as journalists at the same time. And so it is desperately important that we go in, partly to relieve the burden from them and partly to go in with an outside point of view to record what is happening as best we can.
And none of that is taking away from their courage and the quality of their reporting, which we have, of course, relied on for the last few months. And, it's so important that we have these eyes and ears in the Gaza Strip. But as you say, if we can supplement that from someone who's not been inside the Gaza Strip, who's coming from the outside, I think that would make a huge difference. So why are the Israelis not letting us in? Or the Egyptians, for that matter?
Well, I think there are 2 reasons that the Israelis aren't letting us in. I think one is a genuine security reason. They're bombing the Gaza Strip, and they don't want to kill foreign journalists. And they know that they probably would kill foreign journalists because it is so incredibly dangerous because of the kind of war that they are waging there. And then I think the second reason is because I think that they don't particularly want us to report on what the impact of their campaign has been. Now, already we're able to report on that because we can see it from the pictures and reports that we get from our Palestinian colleagues. We can see the terrible suffering amongst civilians and so on. But I think that I don't think it's that the Israelis see it as being in their interest that we should see that. So I see those as the 2 main reasons.
You mentioned at the beginning of this interview the number of countries that we used to go to with relative ease that we can no longer go to now. We can't get visas for Russia, it's very difficult to. We can't get visas for China, or it's very difficult to. North Korea has always been tricky. Iran has been tricky. Lots of places are really tricky. What is going on in the world of politics and media, that the barriers are just, going up over and over the place?
Well, I think that governments, particularly governments that are doing bad things, realise that there is no advantage to them in us reporting what they are doing. And in the past, I think that there was a lot more pressure, certainly from Western governments and so on, that there should be some adherence to freedom of the press. And I think that there is less and less of that now. And I think that also they realise this is just an easy way of stopping the kind of coverage they don't want. And modern media, including social media and so on, means that they can put out their own messages and intimidate the journalists within their own countries and just get out the message they want without anybody coming in and looking at, the other side or the other two or three sides, which there always are. And so that's what they've decided to do.
Sure.
And what it means is that you end up with a very fragmented and difficult picture. On the one hand, in all of these countries, there are incredibly brave journalists and also what we call citizen journalists, just local people taking pictures and reporting and so on, which is why we always have a window onto what's going on. But that does not compensate for fully, for journalists who have got the training, the experience, the understanding, the knowledge, and so on, coming in and doing full reports. So we end up with this sort of jigsaw coverage where we see something of what's going on. We see through the glass darkly, but we don't get the full picture.
And finally, Lindsey, I guess the problem is also that even if we did go in there to get the full picture, and if we did strive to show that picture and get at the actual truth of what's going on the ground, because of the fragmentation of our media landscape, especially in social media, there'd still be plenty of people who say, well, that's Lindsey, Hilsum, Matt Frei, they're talking for that side. I don't believe them, mainstream media, fake news and all that stuff.
Of course, but I can't help that. All I can do is do my job as best I can and as honestly as I can. And I believe really strongly in eyewitness reporting. I believe in being there and talking to people on all sides and people who are on no side. And I believe that is the way to report. And although I know that people can accuse us of all sorts of things, that is how you do honest reporting. You go there and you find out what's going on. And that is what we cannot do in Gaza at the moment. And that is why we are not able to present a full and honest picture to the world. And I think it's really important.